This is the first of 4 little videos I'm going to do on fiscal policy. This one is going to focus on some very basic AS stuff, so essentially the key mechanisms using AS and AD, how does fiscal policy affect the economy, why is it done, and so on. I'm then going to move on to, in different video, more advanced AS theory, which will include some of the various trade-offs which exist, some of the long-term considerations, and a few kind of depends-on factors. Basic A2 is the course requirements for A2, so we'll be looking at different forms of taxation, difference between structural and cyclical deficits, some basic ideas such as crowding out and so on. And then advanced A2 is stuff that is either right at the very top end of the specification or is actually stuff beyond the specification. Quite relevant in the current context, given the kind of what's going on around the world at the moment with fiscal policy. So we'll be looking at things like government debt, credit ratings, austerity, and all of those sorts of things. So the A2 advanced stuff, if you don't get that far, then don't worry about it at all. You can still score very good marks just with the basic A2. So anyway, we are going to be looking then in this context. Okay, we're going to be looking at the basic A2 AS, beg your pardon, fiscal policy. Okay, so basic AS fiscal policy. So key things to bear in mind about fiscal policy. First of all, it's done by the government. It's done using government finances. We'll take a look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Okay. Secondly, it's primarily considered to be a demand-side policy. Okay, so fiscal policy at AS level is predominantly considered a demand-side policy, meaning that it affects aggregate demand within the economy. Okay, now aggregate demand you should be very familiar with from last year. Okay, equally you should be familiar with the fact that it is made up of items, okay, what we call the components. Okay, so aggregate demand doesn't exist as a single thing. It is what we call a composite. It's made up of these 4 elements: consumption, government expenditure, investment, and net exports. Now, as far as AS is concerned, there isn't. You don't need to worry about the link between fiscal policy and net exports. That's not significant as far as the AS is concerned. Okay, so what we are mainly concerned about then is how fiscal policy can be used to control these 3 elements of the domestic expenditure. Okay, consumption, government expenditure, and investment. And there are a few tools that the government has available that it can use to address each of those. So C can be dealt with by changes to income tax and VAT predominantly. G is the day-to-day government spending, so that's, for instance, spending on teachers, on defence, those sorts of things. It can also control I, okay, when a government undertakes to build something, okay, like it builds a road or a hospital or something else like that we would consider infrastructure, apologies for the handwriting, infrastructure, that is the I component. So the government can control each of those 3 components by changing its spending and taxation. It obviously has more direct control over G and the bit of I done by the government. The bit of I done by the firms, they can alter through corporation tax, and C they can alter through taxation as well, but those are obviously less direct. So overall then, how does it work? Well, if we are going for expansionary fiscal policy, okay, and we will assume a Keynesian curve, so we've got our price level up there and our real GDP along here. If the government, let's say, decides that it is going to increase the amount of money it's spending on teachers, then what will happen is we will get an increase in AD from AD to AD1. Okay, which we would draw like that. Okay, we will get an increase, beg your pardon, my micro diagrams there, that's no good. Okay, let's get rid of those. Those shouldn't be Q, those should be Y, beg your pardon, Y on Y1, okay. So what we see here is that the government can increase its spending or reduce taxation. Both will, in theory, have the same effect. and the result is that AD will shift to the right, price level will go up, we will get demand pull inflationary pressure, and importantly, real GDP will rise, unemployment will fall. That's often the intention of expansionary fiscal policy. So just in the next slide then, I'm just going to go on and think about the different forms of tax and spending which the government might decide to undertake. So this is taken from The Guardian. You might have to zoom this out to full screen to actually be able to see this properly. It's quite detailed, but the kind of the main bits are really important. Basically, on the right-hand side, kind of over here, you have all of the different forms of government expenditure, and on the left-hand side over here, you have the different forms of government income. So just as we go around here, this is useful. So rather than saying something along the lines of, the government can increase spending, it's better in your answers to talk about specifically spending on what. So just going around from the top here, they can spend on defence, on education. As you can see, a very significant element of it. Transport tends to be quite favoured because it also contributes to long-run AS improvements, as does education for that matter. But we'll look at that in the next video. Public order and safety, that's things like the police. Health is very obvious. Industry, agriculture and employment. Housing and environment. Debt interest, that's a very important one. We will look at that in the A2 ones. This kind of 51 billion tranche, which is just here. We will look at that later on. Social protection, which is this enormous chunk here. Okay, the largest part of that is pensions, but that also includes various other benefits. And then we've got a chunk here for other. So important thing to note here that the government spends, or this was the 2013 figure, but in 2013 spent 720 billion during the course of that tax year. On the left-hand side, we have the various ways that the government can raise money. You see the biggest chunk here is through income tax. That will obviously affect the level of consumption within the economy. So a reduction in the income tax rate will increase spending, is the normal way we look at it. National insurance is very similar to income tax. VAT is also another consumption tax. So the government could reduce the rate of VAT, hopefully boost consumption. Those are the biggest chunks. Smaller wedges then include other, which is all sorts of other things like stamp duty, which is a tax on buying and selling a home, car tax, various others in there. Corporation tax, this 39 billion tranche here. Okay, again, it's been in the news quite a lot recently. That is what the government can use to try and indirectly stimulate investment and employment by reducing the rate of corporation tax. They enable businesses to keep more of their profits, and so we would hope that the I would increase in due course. Excise duties, this big tranche here, okay, is things like cigarettes, alcohol, petrol, stuff like that. So actually a very large chunk of tax revenue comes from those. Those actually are more the taxes that we saw in micro, what we call the Pigouvian taxes, to correct overconsumption of something. So we do deal with those taxes, but we generally deal with them in micro rather than macro. Important thing to bear in mind, particularly in terms of the A2 videos that we are going to move on to have a look at, is the difference between the amount of money coming in each year in the form of tax and the amount of money going out. So you can see there in 2013, the government spent 720 billion, only took in 612 billion, which leads to this quite scary large red wedge up the top here, which is the amount that the UK government had to borrow in 2013 in order to meet that shortfall. So they had to borrow 108 billion pounds in order to meet that shortfall. We'll be looking much more at the mechanisms of how they do that in the A2 videos, but in the more advanced AS video, we will briefly be looking at how this borrowing here contributes to this debt interest wedge over there. And generally what we say is that the bigger the borrowing becomes, the greater the debt interest that must be paid, and then obviously the less funding is available for other things. So very quick introduction, recap then of fiscal policy, important points. So key points from the from this video. So fiscal policy, done by the government. It uses taxation and spending. It affects C, G, and I components of aggregate demand, and that the UK government runs a deficit, or at least it has done in 2013. So those are the key points to take away from this video. The next video will deal with the more advanced AS theory and then a couple more for your A2 content as well. But those are the key points to take away from this one.